Hi, this is Darryl Lewis Sandy from Mana. Welcome to our third training video in our series about the Olog Assistant. The Olog Assistant provides a graphical user experience for authoring Ologs, for composing facts from aspects, for endorsing instances for your Olog types and aspects, and for systematically reifying your Olog to workspace kinds and functions. Ologs were invented by David Spivak and were first described in the paper Ologs, a categorical framework for knowledge representation. This paper is freely available online, and we will be referring to it often throughout this series of videos. The use of this material is granted under the Creative Commons Attribution License. In today's lesson, we'll be learning how to use the Olog Assistant to give precise meaning to our Olog types and aspects through the process of endorsing instances. Today's lesson uses a ManaQ template workspace service, which contains all the kinds and functions that you're likely to encounter in the course of today's exercise. If you've been following along with us, you already have your own copy of this workspace and should open it now. If you're just joining us, you should take a moment to clone your own copy of the Mana Olog tutorial template. In our previous lesson, you used the Olog Assistant to construct your own Olog that encoded your beliefs about how sports teams were related to their hometown and home state, and then populated it with some facts. Go ahead and open the Olog Assistant in your workspace now and load your Olog. Your Olog may look slightly different than mine, and that's all right, because it encodes your beliefs about teams, their hometowns, and their home states. Any differences that you might have won't keep you from being able to work through today's exercise. Up until now, we've treated our Olog as a kind of conceptual map, which depicted the relationship between types via their functional relationships or aspects. If we followed the rules of good practice, we gave our types and aspects meaningful names such that a subject matter expert would be able to identify instances. Using the ManaQ platform, I could create kinds for every concept that I'd like to reason about, and add fields to those kinds representing their properties. Using this technique, I could create a kind for every type in my Olog, and a property for every aspect of that kind, and then work with a subject matter expert and use the built-in CRUD operations to populate instances of each of those kinds. But the ManaQ platform also allows you to define functions that look up instances in external services or synthesize them from other data that you have on hand or from machine learning processes. This is a much more powerful technique, and this is the approach that the Olog Assistant uses. When we're endorsing instances for our Olog, we will need to provide a function for each type and each aspect. If we're endorsing instances for a type, then the function must return a list of non-null instances of some kind. It also must not have any required arguments, although it can have any number of optional ones. If we're endorsing instances for an aspect, we must provide a function that takes a non-null instance of some kind and returns to us a non-null instance of some other kind. Again, this function can have any number of optional arguments, but it must have exactly one required argument. Conveniently, the built-in CRUD operator that retrieves all the instances of a kind has the correct type signature to be an instance source for types. This means that you have the option to store your instances in a workspace kind and then use the built-in CRUD operator as your endorsed source of instances. When we are ready to endorse instances for our Olog, we can open our Olog in the Assistance panel and then select Endorsement from the Workflow menu on the left-hand side of the Assistant. Then, for each Olog type or aspect that we select, the dialog on the left-hand side will provide a drop-down list of all the available functions that we can use to endorse instances for that kind or aspect. It will only choose functions that are defined in our workspace and have the correct type signature to be used as an instance source. After we've made each selection, we should press the Save button to persist our work. You'll notice that after you've endorsed a few instance sources for types and aspects, that the list will get smaller because it restricts this list to only those functions that would be well typed based on the assumptions that you've given for the aspects or types surrounding it. If you ever find that you need to remove an endorsement, you can press the Unendorse button. You should now have enough information to complete today's exercise. In today's exercise, you will be endorsing instances for the Olog that you created in our previous lesson. Your Olog should express your beliefs about how sports teams are related to their hometown and their home state. To make this exercise easier, there's a knowledge graph pre-populated with some kinds and functions that you may find useful in working through the exercise. Go ahead and select Lesson 3 Endorsing Instances and open that knowledge graph. You will see that it has 4 functions along the left-hand side, which you may need in order to endorse aspects for your Olog. Each of these functions has a correct type to be endorsed as an instance source for an aspect, but have no implementation. That's left to you. On the right-hand side are 3 kinds and several functions that may be useful when creating instance sources for your types. Above the kinds, we have the CRUD operations that retrieve all the instances and individual instances from each of the kinds. And below, we have projection functions that allow you to retrieve individual fields from each of the kinds. The functions null to default city and null to default state are provided in the off chance that you need to deal with exceptional data. Why don't you pause the video here and try your hand at today's exercise. When we resume, I'll share with you my solution. Welcome back. I hope that you all had a chance to work through this exercise and create some instance sources for your Olog, and that you were able to use the Olog Assistant to endorse them. This is one of the most open-ended exercises that we've done, and there are many ways that you could have solved this problem. Let me take a moment now to share with you my solution. I'm going to start by creating instance sources for my types. As you'll recall, I could either populate the kinds that exist in this workspace and use the built-in CRUD operators that return all the instances as my endorsed instance sources, or I could use any function of the correct type that returns a list of instances. To illustrate this point, I'm going to use instances from an external service. In this case, from the Olog template that we cloned our workspace from. I first need to bring that service into my workspace inventory. Now that it's in my inventory, I have access to all of the CRUD operations that it provides and can access the instances stored in its kinds. For example, if I run all cities, we can see that it has 40 entries corresponding to the different cities that Major League Baseball teams call as home. To make the rest of this exercise easier, I'm going to replace the built-in CRUD operations in this workspace with those from the external service. Each of the functions that I've just created has the same type signature as the original CRUD operation and the same name. However, its implementation is simply a function graph that calls the external function. This is a useful design pattern whenever you need to use data that resides in an external service, but want to use the CRUD operations as if it resides in yours. Now that I've created those instance sources for my types, we can use the Olog Assistant to endorse them. Now that we have endorsed the instances for our types, we can see that the choices that are available to us for instance sources for our aspects have been restricted to those that are well typed for the choices that we've already made. As long as I'm here in the Olog Assistant, I'm going to go ahead and endorse those functions as my instance sources for my aspects, and then I'll go back and create implementations for them. Now let's create the implementation of the 4 functions on the left-hand side of my knowledge graph. These are the functions that I endorsed as the sources of the instances for my aspects. I'm going to start here by opening up has as capital, which we know, given a state, should give us the capital city. So it seems like getting the project capital ID from state is a good start. Now we have a problem here that given an ID, we need to get a city. So here I'm going to use the CRUD operation from the template service to look up a city given its ID. So rather than calling the CRUD operation in the template service directly, I'm going to use the wrapper function that I wrote previously. This gives me the flexibility to change the implementation underneath to point at a different service or a different way of generating those instances. Just like the original CRUD operation, this function can return a null value whenever the city isn't found for the ID that it's provided. So to deal with this, we're going to use that null to default function, null to default city, which will take any null value and turn it into a default city. Now I'm going to implement the other 3 functions using the same pattern, where I project out a field, I look up a value, and then I handle any nulls that I encounter. If you work through the challenge exercise in our previous lesson, you might have one more step to endorse your instances. As you recall, I have one additional concept, that of a capital city team. So I have an additional type, an additional aspect that I need to provide instances for. But a capital city team isn't a completely distinct concept. It's a team that satisfies some additional properties. This is what's called a refinement type. Whenever we encounter a refinement type, there's an easy pattern that we can use to create the instance sources for it. I'm going to start by creating a copy of the baseball team kind and renaming it Capital City Team. I'm going to then create a copy of the all baseball teams function that I'm using as an instance source for baseball teams. I'm going to change its name and its return type to be Capital City Team. Finally, I need to create a function for that is aspect. So I'm going to create a new function that takes a capital city team and returns a baseball team, and then implement this using a lambda that just returns the value that I'm provided. Now I can use these as my instance sources for my Olog. You may be wondering why I'm declaring all the instances of baseball teams as capital city teams. It turns out that the Olog assistant has powerful repair capabilities. They're able to inspect the instances that I've endorsed for every aspect and kind and ensure that they satisfy the composition rules and any facts I've declared for my Olog. By using this design pattern for endorsing instances of my refinement type, I'm leveraging the capabilities of the Olog assistant to make sure that the restriction on its instances is enforced. We'll be learning all about the repair capabilities of the Olog assistant in our next lesson. I hope that you enjoyed today's lesson and learning how to use the Olog assistant to provide precise meaning to your Olog's types and aspects. I hope that you'll join in for our next lesson when we talk about reification. If you enjoyed this video and would like to learn more about the Olog assistant or the MonaQ platform, don't forget to subscribe to the Mona Inc. YouTube channel.